My family thought they could take my baby because I was a teen mom. I showed the judge how they abused me growing up, and they lost everything. The courthouse papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered to my cramped studio apartment in Phoenix while my 3-month-old daughter Lily was finally napping after a night of colic. I was 18, exhausted, and barely keeping my head above water, but I was managing. I had a part-time job at a local diner, Lily was healthy and happy, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. Then I opened that envelope and felt my world tilt sideways. Petition for emergency custody and guardianship, the header read. Below it, in cold legal language, my parents David and Margaret Thompson were requesting full custody of my daughter, claiming I was an unfit mother due to my age, financial instability, and concerning behavioral patterns established during her tumultuous adolescence. My hands shook as I read through the document. They painted a picture of me as a reckless teenager who'd gotten pregnant carelessly, who was struggling with substance abuse, a complete lie, who was neglecting my child, and who posed a danger to Lily's well-being. They presented themselves as stable, financially secure grandparents who could provide the loving home that I supposedly couldn't. What they didn't mention in their petition was why I'd left home at 17. They didn't mention the years of abuse, the manipulation, the control that had made my teenage years a living hell. They didn't mention that getting pregnant hadn't been careless. It had been my desperate attempt to create a family that would finally, truly love me. I called my boyfriend Jake, Lily's father, who was working construction across town. He was 21, and while we weren't married, he'd been nothing but supportive since I'd told him I was pregnant. He rushed over, reading the papers with growing anger. "This is insane," he said, pacing my tiny living room while Lily slept peacefully in her bassinet. "You're an amazing mom, Emma. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you and Lily can see that." "But I'm 18 and broke," I said, the reality of my situation crushing down on me. "And they're respectable members of the community. My dad's a successful insurance agent, my mom volunteers at their church. They have a big house in Scottsdale, stable income, no criminal record. What about what they did to you? What about why you left?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. What about what they did to me? What about the bruises I'd learned to hide with makeup? What about the emotional manipulation, the way they'd isolated me from friends, the way they'd controlled every aspect of my life until I'd felt like I was suffocating? But I'd never reported any of it. I'd been too scared, too young, too convinced that no one would believe me. My parents were pillars of their church community, respected in their neighborhood. Who would believe that behind closed doors, they were violent, controlling monsters? I spent that night lying awake, listening to Lily's soft breathing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't afford a good lawyer. I didn't have character witnesses who could speak to my parenting. I'd been so focused on survival that I hadn't built many relationships. On paper, my parents looked like the better option. But I had something they didn't think I'd use: the truth. The next morning, I started making calls. First to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where I'd been treated multiple times as a child and teenager. Then to my old schools, looking for teachers who might remember me, who might have noticed something was wrong. Then to Child Protective Services, to see if there were any records of reports that had been made but not followed up on. What I found surprised me. There were records, lots of them. Medical records showing a pattern of injuries that should have raised red flags. A broken wrist when I was 12 that my parents claimed was from falling off my bike, but which had actually come from my father grabbing me so hard during one of his rages. 3 separate concussions between ages 14 and 16, all explained away as accidents. Burns on my arms that were documented but never investigated. Mrs. Rodriguez, my sophomore English teacher, remembered me well. "Emma, I tried to report my concerns about your home situation multiple times," she told me over the phone. "You were such a bright girl, but you'd come to school with injuries, you'd flinch when adults raised their voices, you seemed terrified of going home." I called CPS twice, but somehow the investigations never went anywhere. I learned later that my father had connections. He'd sold insurance to half the city officials in Phoenix, including people in Child Protective Services. Reports had been buried, investigations had been redirected, and I'd continued to suffer in silence. But now I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I was a mother fighting for my child, and I was going to use every piece of evidence I could find. I spent 2 weeks gathering documentation. Medical records, school reports, photographs I'd hidden over the years showing bruises and injuries. I found my old diary, hidden in a box of belongings I'd grabbed when I left home, filled with pages of detailed accounts of the abuse. I contacted former neighbors who'd heard the screaming from our house but had never intervened. Most importantly, I found Dr. Sarah Martinez, a child psychologist who'd seen me briefly when I was 16 after a particularly bad incident left me with a black eye that couldn't be explained away. My parents had taken me to her once, claiming I was having behavioral issues, but Dr. Martinez had immediately recognized the signs of abuse. She'd documented everything, even though my parents had pulled me out of treatment after that single session. I've been waiting for this call for 2 years, Dr. Martinez told me when I reached out. I knew that someday you'd need these records to protect yourself or your children. Armed with evidence, I found a lawyer who specialized in family law and was willing to work with me on a payment plan. Jennifer Williams was a woman in her 40s who'd built her practice on helping young mothers and abuse survivors navigate the legal system. Emma, she said after reviewing everything I'd gathered, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of child abuse I've seen. Your parents made a massive mistake coming after you legally. They've opened themselves up to scrutiny they probably never expected. The custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, my parents ramped up their campaign against me. They had their church friends calling CPS with anonymous reports about my drug use and neglect of Lily. They spread rumors in their social circle about my promiscuous behavior and mental instability. They were so confident in their ability to manipulate the system that they got cocky. My father even called me directly one evening, his voice full of the condescending authority I remembered so well. Emma, you need to be reasonable about this, he said. You're just a child yourself. You can't possibly provide for Lily the way we can. If you fight us on this, you're only going to embarrass yourself and drag our family name through the mud. Your family name? I repeated, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Dad, after next week, you might not have a family name left to protect. He laughed, that cruel sound I'd heard so many times growing up. You think anyone's going to believe the word of a teenage mother against 2 upstanding members of the community? You think your little tantrum is going to change anything? I guess we'll find out, I said, and hung up. The night before the hearing, I sat in my apartment with Lily on my lap, feeding her a bottle and looking through all the evidence I'd gathered. Photos of bruises, medical records, diary entries, witness statements. The story of my childhood laid out in stark, undeniable detail. Jake sat beside me, holding my free hand. Are you ready for this? No, I said honestly. But I'm going to do it anyway. She deserves better than what I had. She deserves a mother who will protect her, even from her own family. That morning, I dressed carefully in the one professional outfit I owned, a navy blue dress I'd bought for job interviews, and walked into that courthouse carrying my daughter and a folder full of evidence that would change everything. My parents were already there with their lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a 3-piece suit. My mother wore her best church dress and the expression of wounded dignity she'd perfected over the years. My father sat straight-backed and confident, probably already planning how they'd redecorate what they assumed would soon be Lily's nursery. They barely glanced at me as I took my seat at the defendant's table, clearly expecting this to be a quick hearing that would end with them walking out with custody of my daughter. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, and my parents' lawyer began his presentation. He painted me as an irresponsible teenager who'd gotten pregnant carelessly and was now struggling to provide basic care for my child. He presented financial records showing my limited income, photos of my small apartment, and character witnesses from their church who testified to my parents' moral character and stability. Your Honor, he concluded, the grandparents in this case are simply trying to ensure that this innocent child receives the stable, loving home she deserves. The biological mother, while well-intentioned, is simply too young and unprepared for the enormous responsibility of parenthood. Judge Morrison looked at me expectantly. Ms. Thompson, how do you respond to these allegations? I stood up, my lawyer beside me, and looked directly at my parents for the first time since entering the courtroom. They were both smiling slightly, confident in their victory. Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and strong, I'd like to tell you why I left home at 17, and why my parents should never be allowed near my daughter. The courtroom fell completely silent. My parents' confident expressions faltered, and I saw my father lean over to whisper something urgent to their lawyer. My mother's face had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish under the fluorescent lights. Go ahead, Ms. Thompson, Judge Morrison said, her voice gentle but commanding. I took a deep breath and began. Your Honor, from the time I was 7 years old until I left home at 17, my parents physically, emotionally, and psychologically abused me. I have medical records, photographs, witness statements, and expert testimony to support every claim I'm about to make. My lawyer, Jennifer, stood and approached the bench with a thick folder. Your Honor, we'd like to present Exhibit A, medical records from Phoenix Children's Hospital documenting a pattern of injuries consistent with child abuse. As Jennifer distributed copies to the judge and opposing counsel, I continued speaking, my voice growing stronger with each word. When I was 12, my father broke my wrist during what he called discipline for coming home 10 minutes late from school. The medical report states that the break was consistent with a twisting force, not a fall as my parents claimed. When I was 14, my mother gave me a concussion by slamming my head against a wall because I'd forgotten to do the dishes. The hospital record notes that I was brought in with a story about falling downstairs, but the injury pattern didn't match. I could see my parents' lawyer frantically flipping through the medical records, his confidence evaporating as he realized the scope of the documentation I'd assembled. Between ages 7 and 17, I was treated at various Phoenix area hospitals and urgent care centers 37 times for injuries that were always explained as accidents, sports injuries, or clumsiness. But when you look at them together, they tell a different story. Judge Morrison was studying the medical records intently, her expression growing grimmer with each page. Your Honor, Jennifer interjected, we also have Exhibit B, school records and reports from teachers who suspected abuse but were unable to get investigations to proceed. Mrs. Rodriguez had driven down from Flagstaff to testify in person. She stood at the witness stand, her voice shaking with emotion as she described watching me deteriorate over the course of my sophomore year. Emma was one of the brightest students I'd ever taught, but she'd come to school with bruises, she'd flinch when anyone raised their voice, and she seemed terrified of going home. I reported my concerns to Child Protective Services twice, but somehow the investigations were closed without any real follow-up. And did you form an opinion about what was happening in Ms. Thompson's home? Jennifer asked. Yes. It was clear to me that she was being abused. The pattern of injuries, the behavioral changes, the fear. I'd seen it before in other students, but never to this extent. My parents' lawyer objected, claiming the testimony was speculative, but Judge Morrison allowed it to continue. Next came Dr. Martinez, the child psychologist who'd seen me when I was 16. She took the stand with the clinical notes she'd made during our single session. In my professional opinion, Emma was suffering from severe trauma consistent with long-term physical and emotional abuse. She displayed classic symptoms: hypervigilance, dissociation, and what I documented as learned helplessness. During our session, she disclosed multiple incidents of violence at home, including being beaten with belts, having her head slammed against walls, and being locked in her room for days at a time as punishment. Why didn't you report this abuse? The opposing lawyer asked on cross-examination. I did, Dr. Martinez replied firmly. I filed a report with Child Protective Services the same day I saw Emma. But her parents removed her from treatment immediately, and somehow the investigation was closed without any follow-up contact. The pattern was becoming clear. My father's connections had protected them for years, but now everything was coming to light in open court. Jennifer then presented Exhibit C, photographs I'd taken over the years of my injuries, hidden in various places and forgotten until I'd searched for them during my preparation. Images of bruises, cuts, burns, and welts that painted a horrific picture of systematic abuse. Your Honor, I said, standing again, I'd also like to read from my diary, which I kept hidden throughout my teenage years. I opened the battered notebook to a page I'd marked with a sticky note. March 15th, junior year. Dad hit me with his belt again today because I got a B+ instead of an A on my chemistry test. 23 times across my back and legs. Mom watched and didn't say anything. I think the only way I'll ever be safe is if I have a baby who loves me, someone who will need me and won't hurt me. The courtroom was dead silent. I could hear my mother softly crying, but I didn't look at her. Your Honor, I didn't get pregnant carelessly. I got pregnant because I was a 17-year-old girl who was so desperate for love and so terrified of my home life that I thought having a baby was my only escape. And you know what? It was. Having Lily gave me the strength to leave, to build a life where no one hurts me, where I can finally be safe. Judge Morrison looked up from the evidence, her expression stern. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, do you have any response to these allegations? My parents' lawyer whispered frantically with them for several minutes. Finally, my father stood up, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Your Honor, these are all lies. Emma has always been a troubled child, prone to making up stories for attention. These so-called injuries were legitimate accidents, and any teacher or doctor who claims otherwise is simply being manipulated by her dramatic storytelling. So you're claiming that 37 separate medical incidents over 10 years were all coincidental accidents? Judge Morrison asked, her tone skeptical. Children are clumsy, Your Honor. Emma was particularly accident-prone. Jennifer stood up with another folder. Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence. Exhibit D. Records from the Phoenix Police Department showing domestic disturbance calls to the Thompson residence. My heart nearly stopped. I hadn't known about police calls. Between 2018 and 2020, police were called to the Thompson home 11 times for reports of domestic violence. In each case, the officers found no evidence of abuse, and Emma Thompson was coached to tell them that the screaming neighbors had heard was just family arguments, or TV too loud. Jennifer handed the police reports to the judge. However, Your Honor, several of these reports include officer notes describing a teenage girl who appeared fearful and had visible injuries that she claimed were from falling or running into doors. Officer Martinez, who had responded to 3 of the calls, had agreed to testify. I knew something wasn't right in that house, he said from the witness stand. The girl was terrified, always had some explanation for why she was hurt, but it never felt right. The parents were too smooth, too prepared with their answers. But we couldn't prove anything, and the girl wouldn't admit what was happening. Did you file any additional reports based on your suspicions? Jennifer asked. I tried to. I contacted Child Protective Services after the 3rd call, but I was told that the family was already known to the system, and that my concerns had been noted. Nothing ever came of it. By this point, my parents looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Their lawyer was visibly sweating, and several people in the gallery, members of their church who had come to support them, were whispering among themselves with shocked expressions. But I wasn't done. Your Honor, I said, standing once more, I have one final thing to show you. I lifted my shirt slightly, revealing a long scar across my lower back. This scar is from when I was 15 and my father pushed me down a flight of stairs for talking back to him. I landed on a broken piece of concrete at the bottom and needed 17 stitches. The hospital report says I fell while skateboarding. I turned around and lifted my hair, showing a small but permanent indentation in my skull. This is from when my mother threw a ceramic mug at my head when I was 16 because I'd used her shampoo without asking. The emergency room report says I hit my head on a kitchen cabinet. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath. Judge Morrison was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part horror, part admiration. Ms. Thompson, she said quietly, why are you telling us all of this now? Why didn't you report this abuse when it was happening? Because I was a child, Your Honor. I was scared and isolated and convinced that no one would believe me. My parents told me that if I ever told anyone what really happened, they'd make sure I was taken away and put in foster care where even worse things would happen to me. They told me that no one would believe a lying, troubled teenager over 2 respected adults. I looked directly at my parents, who were both staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. But I'm not a scared child anymore. I'm a mother now, and I will do whatever it takes to protect my daughter from the people who spent 10 years terrorizing me. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess. During the break, I could see my parents' lawyer having an animated conversation with them in the hallway. Through the courtroom windows, I watched as several of their church friends left the building, unwilling to be associated with what they'd just heard. When court reconvened, my parents' lawyer made a brief statement. Your Honor, in light of the extensive evidence presented today, my clients would like to withdraw their petition for custody. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, please stand, she commanded. They rose shakily to their feet. Based on the evidence presented in this courtroom today, I am not only denying your petition for custody, but I am also ordering a complete investigation into the abuse allegations. The evidence of systematic child abuse is overwhelming and disturbing. She turned to address the court reporter. Please ensure that copies of all evidence and testimony from today's proceedings are forwarded to the Phoenix Police Department, Child Protective Services, and the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. My parents looked like they were going to collapse. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. Not only had they failed to get custody of Lily, but they were now facing criminal charges for what they'd done to me. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, I am issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting Mr. and Mrs. Thompson from having any contact with Emma Thompson or her minor child. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. She looked at me with something approaching respect. Ms. Thompson, you have shown remarkable courage in coming forward with this evidence. While I cannot undo the trauma you experienced as a child, I can ensure that your daughter is protected from these individuals. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete vindication. Not only had I protected Lily from my parents, but I'd exposed them for what they really were in front of their community, their church, and the legal system. The consequences for them came swiftly. Within a week, my father's insurance business was under investigation by the state licensing board. Several of his clients, after hearing about the court proceedings, began questioning his character and pulling their policies. The company he worked for, concerned about their reputation, placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. My mother was quietly asked to step down from her volunteer positions at their church. The pastor, Father Mackenzie, made it clear that while the church believed in forgiveness, they could not have someone accused of child abuse in a leadership role. Their tight-knit religious community, which had been the center of their social lives for decades, began distancing themselves. The criminal investigation moved forward quickly. With all the evidence I'd presented in family court, the district attorney had a strong case. My parents were charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault, and child endangerment. They tried to plea bargain, but the prosecutor, a woman named Lisa Chen who specialized in child abuse cases, wasn't interested in going easy on them. Cases like this are exactly why children don't report abuse, she told me during one of our meetings. Your parents used their social standing and connections to avoid accountability for years. It's time they faced the consequences. 6 months later, they both pled guilty to reduced charges to avoid a trial. My father received 18 months in prison and 5 years of probation. My mother got 12 months and 3 years of probation. They were also ordered to pay restitution for my medical expenses and therapy costs, and they were permanently barred from working with children in any capacity. Their house in Scottsdale went up for sale to pay legal fees and restitution. My father's business connections, which had protected them for so long, evaporated overnight. Their church friends stopped calling. Their neighbors avoided them. The respectable life they'd built on a foundation of lies and abuse crumbled completely. Today, Lily is 2 years old, and she's the happiest, most secure child I've ever seen. She'll never know the fear I grew up with, never wonder if the people who are supposed to love her might hurt her instead. I finished my GED, started college part-time, and Jake and I got married last spring in a small ceremony with friends who have become our chosen family. I still have nightmares sometimes, still flinch when people raise their voices unexpectedly. But I also have something I never had growing up: the knowledge that I'm strong enough to protect myself and the people I love. My parents tried to take my child because they thought I was too young, too weak, too damaged to fight back. They thought their reputation and social standing would be enough to convince a judge that they were the better option. They were wrong. And in trying to take my daughter away from me, they lost everything they'd spent decades building. Sometimes justice isn't pretty, but it's necessary. And sometimes the scared child you once terrorized grows up to be stronger than you ever imagined.